You know, I had a chance to go see these guys over the weekend at the Mousetrap in downtown Eau Claire, and I'll be damned if once again I couldn't stay up awake. I couldn't stay awake long enough to do that. So I'll have to go meet the Jaggernauts some other time. But in the meantime, we get to welcome you to another beautiful morning up north. It is February 2nd, 2026. I'm Pat Kreitlow. Nice to have you here on Lake Wissota and Chippewa Falls. My guest on Wednesday, my guests will be Heather Dubois-Bournon and Chris Thiel and Chris Hambuck-Boyle, and we'll bring up our old homeroom segment to talk about public education and some of the new things that you need to know. We now know just how many districts will be going to referendum come April. Again, it's going to be a lot because, again, you have a legislature that is underfunding our schools, and so we will talk about that on Wednesday. Today, we get just to talk about the news. And I guess I'll start with the Grammys just because that's what a lot of folks watched last night, myself included. And I have to say, I'm doing a much better job of not mocking what I'm seeing on TV going, I don't know them. Who are those people? In fact, the Best New Artist category, I really liked what they did. And maybe it's not the first time they've done it, but they took all the Best New Artist nominees and had them perform back to back to back to back to back live. And it was really nice. There were a lot of great comments about current events, as you can imagine, not just by Bad Bunny, but others who, again, made note. The way that I would put it is, you know who's in this country? Americans and people who want to be Americans. And yeah, to no surprise, some of the people who want to be Americans or want to be in this country are not good people. Same goes for a lot of the people who are Americans, and that's what law enforcement is for. But to take the approach that we've got to throw at everybody who wants to be Americans, but they're not citizens yet, is stupid, counterproductive, harmful, and now is harming all kinds of people. And I was really glad to see so many artists last night call attention to, the wonder that is American immigration and what it has done for our country. And then just beyond that, it was a real good show. So I hope you got a chance to enjoy that. As far as the headlines today, well, I decided to take the approach of my days of youth, which were a long time ago. Newscasts today on the radio are, well, pretty much non-existent by and large, except on some news talk stations where, they got to get it done in 60 seconds because the attention span just isn't what it used to be. And I grew up at a time when, you had to have news on every station. If you wanted a license to broadcast, you had to give the news. And so on your AM stations, you had newscasts that were 10, 15 minutes long. You had Paul Harvey doing his 15-minute newscast. Over on the FM side, on the music stations, you still had these 1 or 2 minute newscasts, but at least you had them. And it made me wonder, as I was taking notes, and I take notes all day, every day about things in the news that I might want to talk about or might become story ideas. It occurred to me that today could be one of those days where I see, well, if I were back in the olden days and I were filling a 15-minute newscast on just the things I've taken notes on this weekend, there'd be a lot of things that do not get covered on the evening newscasts, which fewer people are watching, much less on the radio, which fewer people are listening to, or even on the interwebs where people have to get their news in little tweets and in short little video clips on TikTok. So we're just going to be a little old school here for just a sec and share some observations on what's going on. And I'll see if I can get it all into 15 minutes or not, because there's about 20 different things here that if I were running one of those old style newscasts, I would think these are things that you would want to know about. So here we go. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services reports that in Wisconsin, there are 22,000 fewer people in this state who have signed up for health insurance through the exchange on the Affordable Care Act, the marketplace there, compared to this time last year. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean 22,000 fewer people in Wisconsin without health insurance, but the number's not zero either. Some of those folks maybe got health insurance through a new job or through some other way, or they now qualify for Medicare or something like that. But 22,000 fewer signups means a whole lot of people going without health insurance. They are just taking a risk. And we talked to a small business owner who really does not like the increased instability of a workforce that isn't covered, thanks to sharply higher premiums because of the way Republicans allowed some of those premium tax credits to expire at the first of the year. And they still want to see the Senate pass a bill that got through the House renewing that health insurance assistance for 3 more years. So head over to my website. The story that I posted late last week is called "Here's the Phony Reason the Senate Hasn't Yet Voted to Restore Affordable Care Act Tax Credits." That's over at upnorthnewswi.com. Story number 2. There's, the real news about things like people not signing up for health insurance. And then there's the make-believe stuff like Donald Trump, again, spreading misinformation that Wisconsin somehow has like more than 7 million voters, but there's only 3.5 million people here. And so, my God, there must be so much voter fraud. And it's such a garbage point, and yet we have to explain it again because the President of the United States passed it along. Now, normally when a president would have a flurry of social media posts and further proof of ongoing cognitive decline, that would be a story in and of itself. It's not, sadly. But let's at least make sure he doesn't get away with the misinformation he was spreading about Wisconsin. And I'll credit Molly Beck from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel with writing about how Trump claimed that Wisconsin has about 3 million more registered voters than there are adults in the state. And is that an argument for mass voter fraud? No, it is not. The state has 3.6 million active registered voters as of January 1st, Molly writes, according to the Wisconsin Elections Commission, which means that if you look at the full voter rolls, the state has 4.6 million inactive voter records. Now, these are former voters who died or moved away, or they registered in another state, or they were convicted of a felony, or they were deemed incompetent to vote by a judge and were removed, or they were removed by the state's voter rolls because of inactivity. And as Molly notes, people listed as inactive voters cannot vote again without re-registering to vote, which would require a proof of residence document. Why don't they delete those things then, those 4.6 million records, if they're not voters anymore? Because then you wouldn't know that they once existed and that they are now falsely trying to vote again. This is so basic. That's why you have the old records on there in case somebody tries to vote in the name of a dead person, and it's there. And yet there's still people that will take that argument and go, gosh, Wisconsin has millions of voters on the rolls, and I can't believe they don't get rid of them. Yeah, there's a reason why. I don't really have much new on the Georgia election file stolen, but I thought it was worth mentioning again because, the facts in Wisconsin won't stop Trump, but Donald Trump is still doing what he can to perpetuate the lie of 2020. We don't know where those Georgia voting records are, and we don't know what's being done to them, if they're being manufactured on par with, I don't know, Hunter Biden's laptop or something like that. So that continues to be a mystery. What's not a mystery is that you have people like Wisconsin Congressman Brian Stile, who are putting forward a new round of proposals meant to engage in voter suppression. Not voter security, not election security, voter suppression. The AP story goes like this. House Republicans are proposing sweeping changes to the nation's voting laws, a long-shot priority for President Trump, which would impose stricter requirements, including some before Americans vote in the midterm elections in the fall. There's a good story about this at the Wisconsin Examiner, written by Eric Gunn, talking about erecting needless barriers for voters, and that these bills by Brian Stile, in and of themselves, undermine trust in an election system that is already secure. But here are the things that Brian Stile is proposing to suppress votes. There's another proof of citizenship requirement, which, by the way, is already required to register to vote. Non-citizen voting is so small as to be nearly non-existent. Why would non-citizens vote and risk being deported? It would, again, call for more photo IDs, which, again, is voter suppression. You already need one to register to vote. And a lot of people don't have photo IDs at their fingertips because of various life circumstances, but they're also not necessary if you've already used it to register to vote. If you break the law, you break the law. But it hasn't happened in anything approaching some kind of a level that would influence elections. Brian Stile would ban mail-only elections, as are done in Oregon and other places, ban ranked choice voting, which is on the increase in some places. There would be sharp restrictions on a person's ability to collect ballots on behalf of some other people. Brian Stile calls it ballot harvesting. I call it helping vulnerable voters like grandma and grandpa who are in nursing homes or in other facilities. And they maybe are veterans or in other ways served for years our country and are eligible voters. But getting to the polls is a concern. So help them vote. Brian Stile would not want to help some of your grandmas and grandpas to vote, or people with developmental disabilities and things like that. Currently, some states allow absentee ballots to be counted if they've been postmarked by Election Day and arrive within a set number of days afterwards. Brian Stile would eliminate that grace period. And all mail-in ballots could not be counted until after the polls close under the bill, which means more middle-of-the-night election returns to gin up phony conspiracies. There would be more micromanaging of state elections to the point that it would jeopardize federal funding based on the whims of federal officials rather than evidence. And Brian Stile's bills would even give private citizens the ability to target communities that vote in ways they don't like by allowing them to sue election officials whom they allege have allowed non-citizens to vote. You live in the suburbs and you don't like how people in the city are voting. Get somebody in the city to sue the city and tie them up in court, alleging they're letting non-citizens vote, driving up costs, driving up taxes. Brian Stile wants to try to take the high ground on this. Don't. He's suppressing votes, pure and simple. And it's shameful. And it again proves that only in one developed nation on earth is there a party that is dedicated to suppressing voters rather than encouraging voters. More election news from J.R. Ross and WisPolitics. We may have covered this on Friday, but Michael Alfonso, the son-in-law of Sean Duffy, one of the candidates for Congress up north here in the 7th District, has a political action committee, a PAC that is supporting him called Northwoods Future PAC. I believe Northwoods Future PAC was registered in Alabama, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to go look at the figure again. But the story here, as reported by J.R. Ross from WisPolitics, is that Northwoods Future PAC has put $2 million in donations up to promote Michael Alfonso's campaign for Congress. $2 million from two sources. $1 million came from Dick Uihlein of Uihlein Office Supplies, and $1 million came from Sean Duffy's campaign account. One more note about elections. There was a special election on Saturday in Texas to fill a seat in the state legislature. It's a state Senate district that hasn't elected a Democrat in 34 years. Voters in that district went for Trump by 14 points just over a year ago. On Saturday, the Democratic candidate won by 17. A 31-point flip in voter sentiment in a deep red district. That doesn't mean all those voters suddenly became Democrats. It means they are American voters who sometimes know that the side you normally support needs a timeout. Scott Walker's name appears in the latest dump of Epstein files made late last week. A dump no doubt designed to try to escape people's attention. It didn't work. The one Wisconsin nugget that has Scott Walker's name on it deals with a fundraiser, and it's the fundraiser that's more the issue rather than Scott Walker. But it gets to talk about some of the timing that surrounds Jeffrey Epstein, the sexual predator. It was a luncheon being put on by a group of New York Republicans in the fall of 2012, according to an email in this latest batch of Epstein documents, inviting Epstein and many other guests to a private lunch with a photo op for Scott Walker, who was getting set to launch his campaign for president. You remember that? I don't either. It was really short. Anyway, you can be sure that these kind of fundraiser events can sometimes cast a very wide net. Nobody is saying that Scott Walker knew everyone who was getting invitations. But my point in bringing it up is that, remember, this is the fall of 2012. And Jeffrey Epstein isn't some unknown at that point, maybe to you, but not to a whole lot of folks. By that point, he had been arrested and charged by federal prosecutors with all kinds of sex trafficking charges. And then the federal sex trafficking charges were mysteriously dropped by a U.S. attorney who, by the way, later became Trump's Secretary of Labor in his first term. The federal charges were converted to lesser state charges, and Epstein served a little time. And then multiple women began coming forward with their stories. And yet, 3 years after serving his state sentence, Epstein is being invited to events like this because he's got money. And Scott Walker needs it, as does everybody else running for office. And as someone, take it from me, who has raised close to $2 million in my political career, which ain't much, but it ain't nothing in the big scheme of things. But there was always something unnerving about not knowing everything about every donor. But you had to raise gobs of money. That's how the system works. So maybe we should make it so that people don't have to raise gobs of money from unknown figures just to serve you as an elected official. Just a thought. Let's do a little preview of something that is coming to Up North News from our reporter, Selena Heller, who writes a story out of Reedsburg about how the cuts to SNAP in the big bloated boondoggle that Trump got passed last year impact school lunches. See, there's Food Share, or SNAP, that helps nearly 700,000 struggling Wisconsinites put food on their tables, according to the Department of Health Services in Selena's report. And Wisconsin is on track to lose more than $300 million in SNAP federal funding because of Trump's cuts and new state requirements that will cost Wisconsin taxpayers more than $300 million extra each year. These requirements and these cuts were put in place by Donald Trump and Brian Stile and Derek Van Orden and Ron Johnson and Scott Fitzgerald and Tony Weed and Glenn Grothman and Tom Tiffany. And the way the rules change is that right now when a struggling family qualifies for SNAP, the kids are directly qualified for free and reduced lunches. But the new law is forcing families to manually complete a school meal application, which many parents won't do out of a sense of shame or maybe just confusion. And so school districts that want to find other ways to feed the hungry kids in their district will incur more costs. So look out for Selena's story coming up this week about how folks in the Reedsburg School District, just one place that's impacted by these new rules, are going to have to jump through more hoops, incur more costs, and watch more kids go hungry. All right, let's move to Donald Trump's private militia occupation efforts on America's streets. From a Wisconsin candidate for governor, Joel Brennan, a proposal to create a state commission that would gather information about federal immigration incidents in order to seek accountability at some point in the future. Brennan told the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel the commission would include judges, retired law enforcement, attorneys, and nonprofit leaders in immigration. They would collect and verify videos, photos, recordings, and statements for possible referral to state or federal justice officials. Now, a proposal like this gets us past the slogans like abolish ICE and gets into the nuts and bolts of daily accountability and the eventual consequences for these rogue militias claiming to be legitimate law enforcement and yet terrorizing Americans and other people trying to become Americans through tactics that are all over the spectrum, ranging from questionable to unethical to illegal to indefensible as a human being. Like what we saw on dash cam car video out of St. Peter, Minnesota over the weekend, where this car pulls in front of a woman's car. She'd been recording what ICE agents were doing. That's it. Observing and recording, as is her right to do. A car of officials chased her down, and on the dash cam video, you can see them pouring out of the car like a clown car and brandishing their weapons right away at this woman right through the windshield. They had the guns drawn and pointed, and though she said she refused to get out of the car, they dragged her out of there. And it took local law enforcement to intervene to stop what had, quite frankly, been a kidnapping in progress because she had committed no crime. These are the tactics of a lawless war zone, which makes sense when you consider what White House border czar Tom Homan said to describe the situation in the Twin Cities. Homan said, quote, "I've met with a lot of people, a lot of agents. They've been in theater. Some of these people have been in theater for 8 months, and so there's going to be rotations of personnel." Theater? They've been in theater? That's how you describe a war zone with combatants, not citizens that you are sworn to serve and protect, and not harass and not kidnap. What's more, federal immigration officers are asserting sweeping new powers to forcibly enter your home without a judge's warrant, according to an internal ICE memo obtained by the Associated Press. The memo authorizes ICE officers to use force to enter a residence based solely on an administrative warrant to arrest someone with a final order of removal. No search warrant is needed. No judicial warrant is needed. Now, that won't stand eventually, but there will be plenty of terror in the meantime. And then, of course, if you don't have a warrant, you can seize someone's child and use them as live bait. Remember this one? That's what happened to 5-year-old Liam Ramos and his father, who were detained by immigration officials in Minnesota, and they'd been held in an ICE facility in Texas. They have now been released following a judge's order and have returned to Minnesota. They were seeking asylum. They weren't undocumented immigrants who snuck across. The vast majority of asylum seekers are released into the United States with adults eligible for work permits while their cases work through a backlogged court system. If only we could fix the system. If only there were some kind of a bipartisan way to streamline this. Oh, wait, there was. And Donald Trump killed it, not because he had a better plan, but because he wanted this racist roundup of anybody who doesn't look like him. In the order granting little Liam's release, U.S. District Judge Fred Beery blasted the administration, writing, quote, "This case has its genesis in the ill-conceived and incompetently implemented government pursuit of daily deportation quotas, apparently even if it requires traumatizing children." Judge Beery chastised the government's, quote, "ignorance of an American historical document called the Declaration of Independence," and called for a more orderly and humane policy than currently in place. He also singled out the use of those administrative warrants in the Trump administration as violating the Fourth Amendment's requirement of probable cause. So much to talk about. I should have poured more coffee. Well, small wonder that there is a government shutdown right now. A small one, but one just the same over Donald Trump's race war and his disdain for the Constitution. House Speaker Mike Johnson, however, is not rushing to hold a vote to end the shutdown in a deal that would separate funding for the Department of Homeland Security from a broader spending package. That's even though the deal was approved Friday by the U.S. Senate, and it would fund DHS temporarily while Congress debates new restrictions on ICE operations. Democrats and some Republicans want to require that federal immigration agents go unmasked and identify themselves as any law enforcement does. They're also pressing for an end to roving patrols, those race-based roundups. Keep in mind, Republicans allocated to the Department of Homeland Security in the big bloated boondoggle bill $190 billion over 4 years, including $75 billion for ICE alone, making it the highest funded federal law enforcement agency. And why they've been hiring all kinds of goons and buffoons who are pulling shit like what you saw in St. Peter. It won't surprise you to learn that Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson doesn't like the idea of reining in ICE's reign of terror, making comments that are, supposed to make you think that anyone that you suspect might not be an American citizen is also a rapist or a drug trafficker. And he blames the unrest on Americans who are protesting. The people trying to ensure that law enforcement abides by the law. Oh, a footnote about that ICE detention facility in Texas where little Liam and his father had been housed. There's a measles outbreak there. Of course there is. This is where I'd pivot to a story about measles cases exploding all across the nation, thanks to the encouragement of ignorance about vaccines. But I've only got so much time, and this should be low-hanging fruit by now. So get your shots updated. If you think some crackpots on the internet are smarter than the entire scientific and medical community, well, we're not supposed to call people dumb. I would happily make an exception in this case, but I will just say, talk to your doctor. I don't have any new reaction to the Don Lemon arrest and the arrest of 3 other journalists, coincidentally, none of them white, except to say that it's amazing that they found time to arrest 4 journalists, and yet almost nobody that you're seeing in the Epstein files, where another 3 million documents, as I mentioned, were released recently, but apparently another 3 million documents are still withheld, with no way to force the Department of Justice to release them. Congress didn't include any teeth in the language of the bill calling for their release. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, is the one responsible for all of this. Somebody who helped Trump cover up misdeeds in Florida before, so why not help more now? Trump is mentioned more than 1,000 times in this latest document dump, including 8 trips on his jet, Epstein's jet, in the 1990s. And while a lot of the men still have their identities hidden, more than 40 women were identified in these documents, even though the information about them was supposed to be redacted. You were supposed to black out anything that might identify Epstein's victims. And yet there are reports that about 40 of these women, of these victims, had identifying information that was released. It's just amateur hour over at the Department of Justice. Some of the men that we know about that were in there include Brad Ratner, director of the Melania movie that we'll talk about in a sec. So many things that you won't hear on the news. Again, just the notes that I see and I go, I never have time to talk about this. Well, I'm taking a little extra time today. There's the Trump deal involving the United Arab Emirates. And the Wall Street Journal reporting this. 4 days before Trump's inauguration, lieutenants to royalty in Abu Dhabi signed a deal with the Trump family to buy a 49% stake in Trump's crypto company, World Liberty Financial, for $500 million. The buyer paid half up front and steered $187 million of it to Trump family entities. So Trump gets millions of dollars in crypto investment from the United Arab Emirates. And if you want to connect the dots, the other dot is that the United Arab Emirates got a sweetheart deal to acquire some advanced computer chips that deal with artificial intelligence. Amazing how that happened. Of all the things that Trump said, we talked about, what he said about Wisconsin voters. There was also in a cabinet meeting last week a note. He likes to repeat the part that says there's been something like $18 trillion of investment in America since he became president. Kelly Loeffler of the Small Business Administration talked about it at the cabinet meeting. And somebody from the Brookings Institution, one of those, center-right think tanks, posted saying, you would have to be economically illiterate to believe that there's been an $18 trillion influx of foreign investment. That would have created GDP growth, not of 6%, which would be amazing, but 60%. And it would have required filling 100 million new jobs. There are currently 7 million unemployed workers. One story you probably did hear about, maybe, was the Kennedy Center, which, Trump went and slapped his name on. All these artists have been, fleeing in droves, canceling shows. You know the saying, everything Trump touches dies? The Kennedy Center is now going to shut down for 2 years. Trump said that, it allows him to transform what he calls a tired, broken, and dilapidated center into the finest performing arts facility of its kind. So first he vandalized the Kennedy Center by slapping his name on it. God knows how he's going to vandalize it over the next 2 years. And finally, the Melania movie, which supporters of the president and the first lady are calling one of the biggest documentaries ever. Well, yeah, when you consider most documentaries are made with a few $1,000s, not tens of millions in corporate bribery. So yeah, making, I think it was $7 million at the box office. That sounds pretty big for a documentary. But when you compare it to the cost of making it, it is a box office bomb of legendary stature. The reviews are scathing. A lot of it just says it's Melania walking into rooms and walking out of rooms. It has no story arc. It has no drama. It has no substance. And it has invited some great posts like, ICE is using empty Melania theaters as temporary detention facilities. Or conversely, a friend of mine is an undocumented immigrant and he's been hiding in a Melania theater because he knows there's no one else in there. My favorite was one that said if they showed the Melania documentary on a plane, people would still walk out. Final story, Giannis trade rumors. Yes, they came up again late last week. Here's what I have to say about the trade rumors about Giannis Antetokounmpo. Brewers spring training camp opens in 10 days. Pitchers and catchers report in 10 days. That's it. That's all you need to know. Birthdays in today's history lesson. Graham Nash is 84 years old today. Christy Brinkley is 72. Stevie Wonder's daughter, Aisha, is 51 years old today. You've heard her if you've ever heard the beginning of Stevie Wonder's song, Isn't She Lovely? There's like it starts with a baby crying, and that's little Aisha, born 51 years ago today. Singer Shakira is 49. Singer Harry Styles turned 32 yesterday. On this day in 1887, in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, the first Groundhog Day was observed. I don't know what happened today there or in Sun Prairie or anything else like that. Sorry. Baseball's National League was formed this day in 1876. Baseball's American League was formed this day in 1900. The teams in 1900 that were first part of the American League were Boston, Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago, St. Louis, and Milwaukee. That original Milwaukee team, formed back in 1900, later became the St. Louis Browns and then later became the Baltimore Orioles. They got started this day in 1900 as a team for Milwaukee. The original Baltimore team folded after a year, however, and was replaced by a New York team that was first called the Highlanders, and they later changed their name to the New York Yankees. I'm just full of baseball trivia today. On the music charts, Dolly Parton had the number one song on the country charts this day 52 years ago with Jolene. Number one country song this day in 1974. And on this day in 1985, Foreigner, and I Want to Know What Love Is, hit number one. It was the first song with a gospel choir to top the pop charts. In our Sunday morning newsletter, we have a question of the week, and the question this week is about a new nuclear power plant for Kewaunee. We note that Energy Solutions is seeking permission to build a new nuclear power plant, hoping to finish construction and begin generating by the year 2038. So, 12 years from now. The company says the plan is in response to rising demand in part from new data center projects. Whatever the reason, our question of the week is, what are your thoughts on new nuclear generation in eastern Wisconsin, new nuclear power? A, you're in favor. Nuclear plants have operated safely in Wisconsin for many years, and it's better than carbon-based power generation. I give you an out with option B, in which you say, well, let's say I'm not opposed to it, but I wish we didn't need it. And then C is you oppose it, you're against it because the potential dangers and or we should be requiring other renewable sources to be pursued first. So that's our question of the week. Get it through our newsletter. Sign up at upnorthnewswi.com. Let's see. A quick update. Oh, this breaking news just in from Todd Alba. Pat, Jimmy in Sun Prairie did not see his shadow early spring. In an unfortunate event, Todd writes, there are unconfirmed reports that Luke Mather's dogs threatened the groundhog if they came up with any other forecast. On the Do Something calendar, which, by the way, we now have as a web page over at upnorthnewswi.com. You can go to our Do Something calendar. Tonight, the State Democratic Party's Environmental Caucus is having a virtual meet and greet with Secretary of State Sarah Godlewski, a candidate for lieutenant governor. That's at 6:30 tonight. Tomorrow, the State Democratic Party's AAPI caucus, Asian American Pacific Islander caucus, will have a virtual meeting with Judge Chris Taylor, candidate for Supreme Court. On Wednesday, the Vilas County Democrats up in Woodruff are going to meet Wednesday afternoon, and they're going to be meeting two candidates, Lieutenant Governor Sarah Rodriguez, who's running for governor, and Ginger Murray, one of three Democrats running for Congress up here in the 7th District. On Friday, a couple of social events here in Stoughton. Drinks with Dems. So look for the information about the Democrats in Stoughton for information on Drinks with Dems Friday evening. And then Saturday morning, the Winnebago County Democrats are holding a coffee and conversation in Oshkosh. And so again, check out our calendar events that way as well. You want to send a note here, go to info@upnorthnewswi.com. The radio might still... I don't know if they've taken that down yet. Radio at upnorthnewswi.com. I should check into that. You never know. Anyway, that's it. That's everything that I've noted on my notepad over the weekend, where I finally wanted to take time to cover some of these stories and talk about them. It took a little bit more than 15 minutes, didn't it? And that just tells you, for everything that gets covered all the time here, there's just so much more going on. And I'm glad I could tell you about a little bit of it. Again, on Wednesday, we'll have Heather Dubois-Boren on, Chris Thiel, Chris Hambuck-Boyle, talking about the ongoing threats from the voucher school system in the budget to paying for public education in Wisconsin. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe to the newsletter, upnorthnewswi.com, and pass along those Up North News social media posts. Thanks for taking a little time today in doing something that I hope helps you feel a little empowered and not overwhelmed as we go about the daily challenges of putting America back on the right path. I'm Pat Kreitlow. See you again soon for another beautiful morning up north.